Modern conflict zones, I mean, they're producing potential targets at a speed and volume that, frankly, just wasn't conceivable even a few years back.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty staggering.
We're hearing figures like, thousands of potential targets identified in mere days or weeks. How are military forces actually processing this flood of surveillance data to find targets so quickly? What's really changed here?
Well, that acceleration, that sheer velocity you're talking about, identifying and potentially actioning targets, that's exactly what the sources we're looking at today are highlighting.
Okay.
They strongly suggest that artificial intelligence, AI, is playing a central and increasingly controversial role in enabling this new tempo, especially in these dense urban conflict zones.
Right. So this deep dive, it's focused specifically on the reported use of these AI systems by the Israel Defense Force, the IDF, particularly in the Gaza Strip during the current conflict. We've got a whole stack of material here. Reports citing anonymous sources, some expert analysis, and importantly, official IDF statements too. Our job is to unpack all of that for you.
Exactly. Our mission here is really to distill the information straight from these provided sources. We want to understand, okay, what are these AI systems described as? How are they reportedly being used in this specific situation?
And crucially.
And most importantly, I think, lay out the really significant questions and the criticisms being raised about their impact, their implications, and, the big ethical and legal considerations that come with them.
Couldn't agree more. The sources, they mention a few key systems by name that have reportedly become pretty central to this whole process. One called the Gospel, or Habsora.
Right, Habsora.
And another one called Lavender. They also briefly touch on a system called Fire Factory. So, our goal for you, the listener, is to walk away from this with a clearer understanding of the picture painted by these sources regarding AI's reported role here. The technology behind it as they describe it, and the whole spectrum of perspectives presented on its use and consequences.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's unpack this pretty complex landscape of information. Where should we start? The Gospel.
Yeah, let's start with the Gospel, or Habsora. The sources describe it as basically a core AI system the IDF uses.
Okay, and its main job. What's it reportedly doing?
Its primary reported function seems to be acting as this powerful filter or maybe a sifting mechanism. It automatically goes through just immense volumes of surveillance data.
Right, like drone footage, comms intercepts, satellite images, all that stuff.
Exactly. Anything it can get its digital hands on, basically.
And it's looking for what exactly?
Right.
Patterns.
It's looking for patterns that it's been trained to associate with the enemy. According to the sources, it identifies things like specific buildings it thinks are linked to militants, maybe pieces of equipment, or even individuals it flags as enemy personnel.
And based on that pattern matching, it then generates recommendations, potential bombing targets.
That's the idea. It recommends potential targets. But, and this is really critical, the sources emphasize, this isn't presented as a fully autonomous kill chain, not at this stage anyway. There's a human involved.
That's a key point that keeps coming up in the descriptions, yeah. The AI makes a recommendation, but that recommendation then reportedly goes to a human analyst.
Right.
And it's that analyst who's supposed to review the AI suggestion and ultimately decide, do they validate this target? Do they pass it on for a potential strike?
So it's framed as a tool assisting the analyst, not replacing the human decision maker for that final sign-off, according to these sources.
Correct. That human-in-the-loop element is described as being there.
Okay, that human-in-the-loop idea is, it's central to a lot of the discussion around these systems. Now, what kind of targets does the Gospel reportedly recommend, based on the source material we have?
It seems to be a range. The sources say it can flag targets that are pretty clearly military things, like individual fighters, rocket launchers, maybe buildings identified as Hamas command posts, standard military objectives.
Because there's more, right.
But yeah, one source in particular flags a more, let's say, sensitive category. The system also reportedly recommends the private homes of suspected Hamas or Islamic Jihad members as potential targets.
Okay, targeting private homes. That detail seems pretty significant, especially given the broader context and some of the allegations we'll get into later.
Definitely. It's a point that stands out.
And this is where we really see the reported impact of the technology on the pace of operations. There's a quote cited in the sources from the former IDF head, Aviv Kohavi, that gives a truly striking comparison about the speed advantage.
Oh yeah, that Kohavi quote. He's reported as saying that the Gospel system could potentially generate something like 100 bombing targets in Gaza per day.
Per day.
And he contrasted that dramatically with the old way of doing things, where human analysts might produce maybe 50 targets in an entire year.
The difference is almost unbelievable. An order of magnitude doesn't even quite cover it.
It's a massive leap. There's another estimate cited in an NPR piece, which draws on that plus 972 local call reporting. It gives slightly different figures, but the comparison is just as stark.
What was that one?
They reported 200 targets generated within maybe 10 to 12 days using the gospel. Compare that to 50 to 100 targets over 300 days for a whole team of 20 intelligence officers using just traditional human analysis.
Wow. So again, accelerating the process from identifying maybe dozens of targets a year to hundreds in a week or even potentially a day.
Exactly. And the sources really frame this speed difference as maybe the primary driver for adopting it. This ability to cycle through the targeting process way faster. It's what military folks talk about as accelerating the OODA loop.
Observe, orient, decide, act.
Right. If you could do that faster than your opponent, you gain a significant operational edge. That seems to be the logic described.
So what's the tech behind it? How does the gospel actually do this, according to the sources?
The sources describe the foundation as machine learning. Basically, the system is trained on enormous data sets of information that humans have already looked at and labeled.
Okay.
So, for example, analysts would have identified and tagged huge amounts of surveillance data in the past. Data linked to known Hamas members, known facilities, that kind of thing. The machine learning algorithm chews through all these examples to find common patterns, features, characteristics within that labeled data.
So it essentially learns what a target looks like based on what humans told it was a target before.
Pretty much, yeah. Then, when it gets fed all the new, raw, unlabeled surveillance data pouring in constantly, it uses those patterns it learned to scan for similar characteristics, to look for matches.
And its recommendations are based on finding those statistical matches.
Exactly. Finding statistical correlations, probabilities. There's an AI expert cited in NPR, Heidi Clough, who makes a really important point here.
What's that?
She stresses that these recommendations are based on pattern matching and statistical probability. They're not based on reasoning, like a human would reason, or on factual evidence in the traditional sense, or understanding causation. It's just math based on patterns.
That's a critical distinction.
It is. And she also notes something else important, that AI algorithms, especially when you're dealing with complex tasks needing high precision and safety, well, they're notoriously prone to making errors.
Right, the garbage in, garbage out problem, potentially. What about the actual data sources feeding into this? The sources say it's not fully public knowledge, but experts have ideas.
Yeah, the exact inputs aren't laid out, but experts speculate it's likely combining just massive amounts of surveillance data from all sorts of places.
Like what?
The list suggested includes things like drone footage, intercepted communications, satellite imagery, maybe cell phone metadata or messages, even things like seismic sensors, perhaps looking for tunnel activity, a whole range.
And the sources mention another layer to this process. It's not just gospel.
Right. They suggest that this huge volume of raw data is often first sort of pre-processed, aggregated, and classified by other AI systems before it even gets to the gospel for the targeting analysis.
So it could be like an AI pipeline, multiple systems working together.
Potentially, yes. Yeah. Not just one system in isolation. That's the picture some sources paint.
And where does this system, the gospel, fit into the bigger IDF structure? The sources say it's used by a specific unit.
It's reportedly used by the military's Target Administration Division, sometimes called the Directorate of Targets or Targeting Directorate. This division was apparently set up back in 2019, specifically within the IDF's Intelligence Directorate.
And its purpose.
One of its main stated goals, according to the sources and people like Kohavi, was specifically to tackle a problem the IDF kept running into in previous conflicts, like in 2014, 2021. They kept running out of good targets.
Running out of targets. So this wasn't just about speed, it was about volume too.
Exactly. Kohavi described this new division as being powered by AI capabilities, staffed by hundreds, tasked with keeping a constant pipeline of potential targets flowing. It was explicitly about generating a significantly higher volume of potential targets to sustain operations.
And the sources report this division, using systems like the Gospel, helped build up a pretty big database.
Yeah, they reported helped build a database listing somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 suspected militants in recent years. And the development of the Gospel itself is attributed to Unit 8200.
Israel's main signals intelligence unit, often compared to the NSA or GCHQ.
That's the one. And the sources mention the gospel wasn't brand new for this conflict either. It was reportedly used back in the 2021 conflict. Operation Guardian of the Walls.
How much was it used then?
Reportedly generated about 200 targets out of the roughly 1,500 total struck by Israel and Gaza during that fighting, identifying both, static locations and moving targets.
And wasn't there a specific issue flagged with the Gospel after that 2021 use? Something mentioned in an after-action report?
Yes, exactly. A report from JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, cited in NPR, pointed out a potentially significant issue.
What was it?
Well, the system had been trained, logically enough, on data representing what was considered a legitimate target based on past human intelligence work. But according to this report, it apparently lacked enough training data on what wasn't a target.
So leads that humans had looked at and thrown out.
Right. Intelligence leads that human analysts had previously reviewed and decided not to target. Those weren't fully fed back into the AI's training data, according to the report.
And the potential problem there is bias.
Yeah, bias. Exactly. If the system only really learned what a target looks like, but doesn't get enough examples of what a non-target looks like, or maybe if the initial data reflected human biases or mistakes, well, it could just repeat or even amplify those problems.
That expert Heidi Klopf made that point too, right? The system just reflects the data it's trained on.
Precisely. It risks algorithmic bias, just mimicking human errors or prejudices that might have been in the training set. The JINSA vice president mentioned in that NPR piece expressed hope that this specific data gap issue had been fixed since 2021.
Okay, that gives us a pretty detailed picture of the Gospel's reported function, context, and some potential issues, all based on these sources. Now, let's pivot to Lavender.
Right, Lavender.
The sources describe this as another key AI-powered database. And several intelligence officers cited in The Guardian and plus 972 local call reports claim it became absolutely central to the war effort.
Yes, those testimonies from 6 intelligence officers shared with those outlets, they state Lavender's main reported function was rapidly processing info specifically to identify individuals.
Individuals. Okay, so unlike the Gospel, which focused more on buildings and locations.
Exactly. Lavender was reportedly aimed at finding potential members of militant groups, particularly the more junior operatives. One source even claimed that, at one point, the system had identified and listed up to 37,000 Palestinian men that the AI had somehow linked to Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
37,000. That's a huge number. And the sources say Lavender was used alongside the Gospel?
Correct. They worked in tandem, reportedly. Gospel identifying broader targets, including structures, and Lavender focusing specifically on compiling this list of potential individual operatives.
And these accounts from intelligence officers, they describe a really dramatic shift in process after October 7th.
Yeah, a major change. Before that date, identifying individuals as potential targets reportedly involved a much slower, more manual, labor-intensive process.
What did that involve?
It needed significant human intelligence work, internal discussions, reviews, and crucially, sign-off from a legal advisor before someone could even be added to a target list.
And that all changed or accelerated after October 7th, according to these sources.
Dramatically accelerated. The sources described just immense pressure from the top to generate a massive number of targets very quickly. And this apparently led to what these officers characterize as a heavy reliance on Lavender.
There's that striking quote from one officer.
Yeah, it really paints a picture of the perceived shift in the human role. He said, "I would invest 20 seconds for each target at this stage and do dozens of them every day. I had zero added value as a human apart from being a stamp of approval."
20 seconds per target. That's almost impossible to grasp compared to traditional intelligence work. It speaks volumes about the reported level of automation.
It really underscored the scale of automation being described. The sources also touch on the justification given internally for relying so much on AI, especially for these lower-ranking targets.
What was the rationale?
The feeling conveyed by the sources was essentially, in wartime, with this urgent need for targets, there just wasn't time for the careful, painstaking identification process that used to apply to every single potential individual target.
So instead of using up valuable human intelligence resources and time to meticulously verify every potential junior militant,
they were reportedly, in the words of one source, willing to take the margin of error of using artificial intelligence.
accepting a certain error rate.
Exactly. Accepting some level of error was apparently seen as an acceptable trade-off for getting that sheer volume and speed of target generation. Even if it meant, as the source explicitly stated, accepting the risk of collateral damage or civilians dying. It's described as a pretty stark operational calculation.
Did the sources mention anything about Lavender's reported accuracy?
Yes. According to those intelligence officers cited, the Signals Intelligence Unit, Unit 8200, reportedly worked on refining Lavender's algorithm. They apparently did some sampling, cross-checking his predictions against existing intelligence.
And what did they conclude?
They reportedly concluded that Lavender had about a 90% accuracy rate in identifying these potential militants.
90%.
And this reported 90% accuracy rate was supposedly a key factor that led the IDF leadership to approve its sweeping use for generating these target recommendations for individuals.
90% sounds high, but I mean, a 10% error rate on a list of potentially 37,000 names. That's still thousands of potentially wrong identifications, right?
That's the immediate mathematical implication, yes.
Yeah.
A significant number of potential errors, even at 90% accuracy.
And do the sources explain how Lavender actually makes these connections? What specific data points or methods does it use to link someone to Hamas or PIJ?
That's where the sources, specifically those accounts shared with The Guardian and plus 972 local call, explicitly state there's a gap in the information.
Oh, okay.
While they report on the system's function and the scale of its use, they say that details about the specific kinds of data used to train Lavender, or the actual logic the program follows to decide someone is linked. That information wasn't included in the testimonies they received.
So the how it works internally remains somewhat of a black box, at least based on these reports.
That's what these specific reports indicate, yes. That opacity is often a point of discussion with complex AI systems.
Right. Okay, so we have Gospel for structures and broader targets, Lavender reportedly for identifying individuals, especially junior ones. The sources also mention a third system, Fire Factory.
Yeah, Fire Factory. It's described as another AI tool, but it reportedly comes in later in the targeting cycle.
After a target's been approved.
Exactly. After a potential target recommendation, whether it came from Gospel, Lavender, or traditional intel, has been reviewed and okayed by a human analyst.
And its job isn't identification.
No, totally different role. Fire Factory's reported function is to automate the complex planning involved in assembling the actual attack itself.
Ah, the logistics.
Right. A pre-war Bloomberg article cited in the sources describes its capabilities. It apparently calculates the right munition loads for strikes, it prioritizes targets, it assigns potentially thousands of approved targets to specific aircraft and drones, and it even proposes a schedule for carrying out those strikes.
So if Gospel and Lavender are about finding the what or who to hit, Fire Factory is about optimizing the how and when to hit them efficiently.
That's a good way to put it. And like the other systems, the big advantage reported is speed.
How much faster?
The Bloomberg piece characterized Fire Factory as cutting down the time needed to assemble an attack plan from potentially hours down to just minutes. Plus, a few extra minutes needed for a final human check.
So it complements the speed up in identification with a speed up in execution planning.
Exactly, accelerating that part of the ODI loop too. The article also mentioned Fire Factory was presented as being particularly useful for complex scenarios like multi-front wars or proxy conflicts, suggesting its design anticipated situations needing rapid, large-scale targeting.
Okay, so we have these three systems described: Gospel, Lavender, Fire Factory. Before we really dig into the reported impact of all this, it seems absolutely crucial, given how sensitive this is and the conflicting accounts, to clearly lay out the IDF's official statements and position on their use of AI, particularly regarding Lavender as presented in the sources.
Yes, absolutely essential. The source material does include the IDF's response to these allegations,
right,
especially the ones about Lavender.
What do they say?
The IDF states that, in their view, some of the claims made in these reports are baseless. Others, they contend, show a flawed understanding of IDF directives and international humanitarian law.
Do they specifically address the idea of AI identifying or predicting terrorists?
Yes, they state explicitly that they do not use an AI system that identifies terrorist operatives or tries to predict if someone is a terrorist.
So how do they characterize these systems?
Their position is that these information systems, like what Lavender is described as, are purely tools, just tools to help analysts. They're designed to assist analysts in gathering, cross-referencing, and analyzing intelligence from lots of different sources, all as part of the broader process of identifying legitimate military targets.
And they emphasize the human role remains central.
Very strongly. The IDF's statement asserts that their standard procedures and directives require analysts to conduct independent examinations of potential targets.
Independent checks.
Yes, to verify that these targets meet the relevant definitions for legitimate military objectives, fully in line with international law and also additional specific restrictions laid out in IDF directives.
How do they describe Lavender itself then, if not as a system identifying targets?
They clarify that what some reports might call a system like Lavender is not, in their framing, a system that confirms operatives or creates a list of already confirmed targets. They describe it instead as a sophisticated database.
A database.
Yes, a database used to aggregate and cross-reference various intelligence sources. This process, they say, produces up-to-date layers of information which help analysts build profiles and gain situational awareness about the military operatives of terrorist groups.
Okay. So the IDF's position, as presented in the sources, frames these tools not as autonomous decision makers or predictors, but as advanced intelligence management and analysis databases. Databases that support human verification and decision-making, which they say remains bound by international law and their own internal rules.
That's their stated position. It's a very different framing compared to some of the descriptions based on those anonymous sources.
Definitely. And it's really important for you, the listener, to keep both of these contrasting accounts in mind as we now discuss the reported impact of these systems.
Indeed. Let's turn to that reported impact now, focusing on the sheer scale and the changing nature of the targeting that the sources describe happening in this conflict, potentially enabled by these systems.
We touched on the speed earlier and how it connects back to that problem the IDF reportedly had in previous conflicts, literally running out of targets. Yuval Abraham from Plus 972 magazine, whose reporting is central to some of the source material he's quoted, describing that pressure in past wars, like 2014 and 2021.
What did he say?
That when high-quality targets got scarce, there was reportedly immense pressure to just keep the bombardment going, sometimes apparently even bombing the same places twice just to maintain that operational tempo.
A pressure to keep striking, even when good targets were limited.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the reported scale in the current conflict. According to the sources, the IDF reportedly stated in early November that its Target Administration Division, using systems like the Gospel, had already identified over 12,000 targets in Gaza since the conflict started.
12,000 by early November.
And by mid-December, military figures cited in the sources indicated that over 22,000 targets had actually been struck inside Gaza.
22,000 strikes. That's a truly massive number in what was then just over 2 months of intense conflict.
Yeah, and the sources explicitly compare this pace to previous operations. The daily rate of strikes is reported as being more than double the rate seen in the 2021 conflict.
Double the daily rate.
And just in the 2 weeks after the temporary truce collapsed in early December, those military figures cited show over 3,500 targets were struck in Gaza. That's an average of 250 strikes per day during that period.
The intensity is hard to fathom. There was that revealing quote early on from the head of the Israeli Air Force, cited in the sources.
Right, what was that again?
He said they were diligently only striking military targets, but then he added that crucial caveat, "We are not being surgical."
Not being surgical. That statement, coupled with the rapid pace and the sheer volume of strikes reported, it paints a picture of an intensity and scale of bombardment in a dense urban area that's just unprecedented compared to previous Gaza conflicts, according to these accounts.
Yeah, the descriptions suggest a different level of intensity.
And beyond just the huge number of strikes, the nature of the targets reportedly shifted too. A change potentially enabled by systems like Gospel and Lavender, especially their ability to rapidly process data on individuals.
How so?
Well, the sources describe that, as often happens, senior Hamas leaders tend to go deep underground into tunnels right at the start of a major conflict, making them incredibly hard to find and target.
Right, the top leadership becomes elusive.
So according to these accounts, this shifted the focus. Systems like Lavender reportedly allowed the IDF to quickly identify and then target a much larger pool of more junior operatives. Individuals who might be less well-known, less protected, maybe lower down the chain.
Ah, okay. So the AI helped find the lower-hanging fruit, so to speak, when the senior leaders were hard to reach.
That's the dynamic described. And this reported focus on junior members apparently led to a significant change in where they were targeted.
How did that change?
One source familiar with past operations reportedly stated that previously, the homes of junior Hamas members were generally not considered legitimate targets for bombing, specifically to avoid civilian casualties.
That was the policy before.
According to this source, yes. But they stated that policy appeared to have changed in the current conflict. Now, the houses of suspected operatives were reportedly being targeted regardless of their rank or their importance within the organization.
So targeting the homes of even low-level suspected members became acceptable. according to this account.
That's what's reported. Yuval Abraham, citing his sources, characterized this as a kind of systematization.
Systematizing what?
He described it as enabling the military to systematize the process of dropping a very large bomb, like a 2,000-pound bomb capable of taking down an entire multi-story building, dropping it onto a home with the main goal of killing just one suspected individual inside, even if that meant knowingly killing everyone else in the building.
That's a heavy description.
He contrasted this with the past, where that level of accepted collateral damage was reportedly reserved only for a very small, extremely senior group of Hamas leaders. Now, he suggests this approach is reportedly being applied to potentially thousands of targets identified with the help of these AI systems.
Wow. And there was that related point in the NPR article referencing the +972 local call report.
Right, they cited the assertion from those anonymous sources that the system was being used, in their view, to essentially manufacture targets at an enormous rate.
Manufacture targets, meaning?
Meaning, according to this claim, not solely for direct military advantage against key assets, but as a way to simply keep bombarding Gaza continuously, maintain pressure, and perhaps punish the general population.
That's a very strong allegation.
It is. And the NPR article was careful to note they hadn't independently verified that specific assertion about manufacturing targets for punishment, but they did highlight the undeniable context. The dramatic increase in targeting volume and the absolutely devastating civilian death toll reported by Palestinian health officials and international bodies.
Okay, so this really brings us squarely to the core tension in the sources. This significant gap between the IDF's stated claims of precision and minimizing harm versus the counterclaims and observations of widespread devastation reported by critics and outlets citing anonymous sources.
Let's lay out the IDF's position on precision first, as it's presented in the sources we have.
Okay. The IDF statements emphasize that their systems and their operational methods allow for precise attacks on infrastructures associated with Hamas.
Precise attack.
While causing great damage to the enemy and minimal harm to those not involved. That's the official line. Reports in Israeli media, also cited in the sources, echoed this, stating the military makes sure as far as possible there will be no harm to non-involved civilians.
Did they mention any specific tools for assessing civilian presence?
Yes. There's a description of an algorithm reportedly used before a strike. Its purpose is supposedly to evaluate the rate at which civilians are evacuating a building and estimate how many might still be inside.
How accurate is it claimed to be?
It was described by a senior Israeli military source as being very accurate, providing a sort of visual cue, green, yellow, red, like a traffic signal, indicating the estimated civilian presence level.
And what about the bombs themselves, the munitions? The IDF addresses the precision aspect there too.
They do. They state that the clear majority of munitions used in strikes are precision-guided munitions. But they also address the use of non-precision munitions, what are often called dumb bombs.
What does it say about those?
They state that aerial munitions without precision guidance kits are standard weaponry used by developed militaries. They assert that when these are used, they rely on advanced onboard aircraft targeting systems and highly trained pilots to ensure high precision anyway.
So they claim even dumb bombs can be used precisely.
That's their assertion. They say their choice of munition is based on a careful assessment of operational needs and humanitarian considerations, looking at factors like the building itself, the environment, potential effects on nearby civilians, and infrastructure.
Okay, so that's the IDF's stated position. Precision attacks, minimal collateral harm where possible, careful munition selection, even accuracy with unguided bombs. Now, let's look at the starkly contrasting picture presented by critics, experts, and observations cited elsewhere in the source material.
Right. Richard Moyes, from the disarmament group Article 36, is quoted arguing very forcefully that these claims of precision and narrow targeting are simply not borne out by the facts you can see on the ground.
What does he point to?
He points directly to the widespread flattening of an urban area with heavy explosive weapons as clear evidence that contradicts claims of highly discriminate surgical targeting.
And Professor Lucy Suchman.
She is a professor emeritus and a prominent critical voice on automated warfare. She's cited describing the overall bombing campaign much more broadly, characterizing it as being aimed at maximum devastation of the Gaza Strip. A very different framing.
A very different framing indeed. And then you have those specific allegations from the anonymous intelligence officers cited in The Guardian and +972 local call reports. They directly challenge the precision narrative, especially regarding targeting individuals.
What did they allege specifically?
They reportedly alleged that these lower-ranking suspects were often preferentially targeted at home, not necessarily because it was the most militarily sound option, but because, as one source bluntly put it, it was simply much easier to bomb a family's home.
Easier logistically, perhaps, than trying to find them elsewhere.
That seems to be the implication, and there are some very specific and frankly disturbing allegations about the type of bombs reportedly used in these cases, targeting low-ranking militants identified by AI at home.
What type of bombs?
According to two of these intelligence sources, these attacks on low-ranking militants were typically carried out using those dumb bombs, the large unguided munitions, and the rationale given for using dumb bombs in these cases.
The reported rationale was chillingly pragmatic. You don't want to waste expensive precision bombs that are in short supply on unimportant people. Using these powerful, less precise bombs to destroy entire homes, which would inevitably kill everyone inside, was reportedly the standard approach in these situations.
So the main calculation wasn't precision, but...
According to one source, the main question when deciding whether to approve such a strike became simply, was the expected collateral damage the anticipated number of civilian deaths within the pre-approved limits set for that target?
This point about allegedly using dumb bombs systematically to target the homes of thousands of lower-ranking individuals linked via AI conflict experts cited in the Orient, The Guardian suggests this could be a major factor explaining the incredibly high civilian death toll.
Yes, they connect those dots. If potentially thousands of homes belonging to Palestinians linked via AI systems to militant groups were targeted this way with large, unguided bombs, that practice, they suggest, could directly account for the shockingly high death toll reported in Gaza during this conflict. And
there was that other, particularly grim, alleged program mentioned, Where's Daddy?
Right. Cited from an Israeli official speaking to plus 972 local call. This program reportedly involved tracking suspected militants until they returned to their family homes.
And then,
once they were confirmed to be at home, the directive was literally to bomb them there without hesitation as a first option.
The same rationale again? Easier target?
Apparently so. The same reported reason. Much easier to bomb a family's home than to try and isolate the individual elsewhere, even though it meant accepting the high probability of killing the target's family and neighbors along with them.
These accounts, it's worth noting, aren't solely confined to Gaza in the source material provided. There's an example cited of a strike outside Gaza.
Yes, in southern Lebanon, a strike in a residential area of Bint Jbeil. It reportedly killed 2 Australian brothers. One was later claimed as a member by Hezbollah, but it also killed the wife of one of the brothers who was a civilian.
And the local reaction?
The mayor of Bint Jbeil was quoted describing it as a surprise attack hitting a civilian neighborhood. He noted people were living normally there, they hadn't fled. While Hezbollah later included the civilian family members in a funeral, the point highlighted in the report is the targeting of a residential area, resulting in civilian deaths, linked potentially to one individual claimed by an armed group.
So these contrasting narratives, the IDF's emphasis on precision and careful assessment versus these reports citing anonymous sources alleging systematic targeting of homes, often with large unguided bombs based on AI recommendations, leading to massive civilian casualties, they really underscore the profound difference in how the operational reality is being perceived and described in the source material we're examining.
Absolutely. And this stark divergence in reporting and perspective leads us directly into the significant ethical and legal questions that experts in ethics, AI, international humanitarian law are raising, as cited across these sources.
What are the main criticisms from these experts?
They express really deep criticism about the reported use and impact of these AI systems. They argue that their application, as described in some reports, potentially violates fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, or IHL.
And that's presented as the core legal and ethical debate here.
Yes, that's central. They point to core IHL principles like military necessity attacks must be needed for a legitimate military goal. Proportionality civilian harm can't be excessive compared to the expected military gain. And the crucial principle of distinction, the absolute obligation to distinguish between combatants and civilians and only target combatants and military objectives.
And the critics argue the reported methods undermine these.
They argue that methods like the alleged systematic targeting of homes with high expected civilian casualties, potentially facilitated by AI enabling targeting on a mass scale, seem fundamentally incompatible with these core legal principles.
There's also the issue of accountability, which you mentioned we'd come back to.
Right. But before that, there's one of the most frankly, alarming allegations in the source material. It comes from those testimonies of intelligence officers cited in The Guardian, and plus 972 local call concerning alleged pre-authorized civilian casualty limits.
Pre-authorized limits on killing civilians.
That's the allegation, perhaps the most controversial claim presented. These officers reportedly testified that the IDF had imposed preset authorized limits on the number of acceptable civilian casualties for each individual militant target. Not a general rule, but a specific number attached to killing a specific person or type of person.
And these alleged limits varied.
Yes, reportedly depending on the rank of the militant being targeted. According to these sources, there was literally a calculation for how many civilians could be killed, based on rank, brigade commander, battalion commander, etc.
What kind of numbers are we talking about, according to these allegations?
For top-ranking Hamas officials, the alleged pre-approved limit for acceptable civilian deaths was reportedly over 100 civilians per target.
Over 100 civilians for one target.
That's the claim. For junior militants, the number reportedly varied. In the first week, it was allegedly 15 civilians, sometimes apparently as low as 5, but critically, at one point, one officer testified the limit was set as high as 20 uninvolved civilians authorized to be killed for targeting a single operative, regardless of that operative's rank, importance, or even age.
20 civilians for any single operative, regardless of rank. What did IHL experts say about these specific allegations when presented by The Guardian?
They expressed deep alarm, reportedly. They stressed that international humanitarian law absolutely requires militaries to conduct a specific contextual proportionality assessment for each individual strike.
Case by case.
Exactly. Weighing the expected civilian harm against the anticipated military advantage for that specific attack in that specific place at that specific moment. It is simply not permissible under IHL to set pre-approved categorical limits on acceptable civilian deaths per target type, especially not numbers anywhere near as high as those reportedly alleged.
Okay. Now, faced with these incredibly specific and serious claims about pre-authorized kill limits, what is the IDF's response as provided in the sources?
The IDF statement included in the sources directly counters this. They assert that their procedures mandate an individual assessment of both the anticipated military advantage and the expected collateral damage for each and every target.
Individual assessment, not categorical limits.
That's their stated position. These assessments are made individually, case by case, not categorically. They use various methods, they say, to ensure accuracy in these assessments. Furthermore, they state explicitly that the IDF does not carry out strikes when the expected collateral damage is deemed excessive relative to the anticipated military advantage.
And they address the broader implication of targeting homes.
Yes, they specifically and outright reject the claim regarding any policy to kill tens of thousands of people in their homes, which seems to be a response to the potential cumulative outcome of the alleged practices.
So, another major point of contention clearly laid out in sources. Anonymous officers alleging systematic, pre-authorized kill limits versus the IDF's official statement insisting on individual, case-by-case proportionality assessments for every single strike.
A fundamental disagreement on reported procedure versus stated policy. Beyond the legality of the targeting criteria itself, another critical area of concern raised by experts cited relates to the human element specifically, the limits of human review when dealing with these automated systems, and this thing called automation bias.
Automation bias. Can you break that down simply as the sources describe it?
Yeah, Dr. Marta Bowe from CICEPRI is cited explaining this risk.
Automation bias is basically the tendency humans have to over-rely on automated systems. We sometimes give their outputs too much weight, influencing complex decisions, even when a human is supposed to be the final check. We can get complacent or just assume the machine is right.
And how might this play out with analysts using these high-speed targeting systems, according to the sources? Well, sources like Richard Moyes suggest that when commanders or analysts get these long lists of targets spat out by a system like Gospel or Lavender, they might not actually know how the system reached those conclusions. They might lack the time, or maybe even the ability, to properly interrogate or question the AI's output.
So they just accept it.
There's a described danger that, especially under pressure, the human analyst could lose their capacity to really meaningfully consider all the factors, like the risk of civilian harm for each specific target. They could effectively become, as one source described it, just cogs in a mechanized process.
And the sheer volume and speed we talked about earlier would surely amplify that pressure on human judgment, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lucy Sechman points this out. The immense pressure from the sheer volume of targets reportedly being generated would inevitably squeeze the time and mental space available for careful human judgment and review. Tel Mimran from Hebrew University is quoted saying that under that kind of pressure, analysts are just naturally more likely to go with the AI's recommendations, whether they're right or wrong. It's faster, it's easier.
The path of least resistance.
Exactly. He warns that this temptation to just flow with the machine's recommendations could create a whole new level of problems, especially if the machine is systematically getting things wrong, like misidentifying targets or not properly factoring in critical nuances like civilian presence.
So even if you have a human technically in the loop, the operational environment, the speed, the volume, the pressure, maybe a lack of full transparency into the AI's reasoning can seriously limit how effective that human oversight actually is in practice.
That's the concern raised. And beyond those human oversight limits, there are the inherent technological limitations and the potential for bias within the AI systems themselves, a point experts cited keep emphasizing.
We touched on this, but it bears repeating. AI isn't thinking like a human.
Right. As the sources and experts like Heidi Klaf reiterate, these systems work on statistical probability and finding patterns. They don't understand context or reason in a human way. Bianca Baggiariti points out that AI generally works best in predictable, stable environments.
In war zones or anything but.
Precisely. The task of distinguishing a combatant from a non-combatant in a chaotic urban setting, especially when people aren't wearing uniforms or might not be actively fighting at that exact moment, that's incredibly complex even for highly trained humans. Technology, she notes, doesn't magically solve that fundamental difficulty.
And the system's reliability hinges entirely on its training data.
Entirely. Which brings us back to the risk of algorithmic bias. If the data used to train the system has flaws, inaccuracies, or reflects past human biases, maybe biased intel gathering, maybe mislabeled examples, or like that reported issue with the Gospel in 2021, not enough data on non-targets, the AI will learn those flaws and potentially amplify them.
It just mirrors the patterns, good or bad.
Exactly. It's not making an independent moral judgment. It's just reflecting what it was shown in the data.
So all these factors, the risk of automation bias, limiting human review, the intense pressure of volume and speed, the inherent tech limits, the risk of algorithmic bias, they all feed into this really significant challenge. Accountability. Who is responsible when AI is involved in lethal mistakes?
Heidi Klaf raises this exact difficulty. International law generally holds humans legally responsible for military actions. But figuring out who is truly accountable when a complex AI system contributes to a bad targeting decision that kills civilians, it gets incredibly murky in practice.
It's not just the person who pushed the button, potentially?
No. Is it primarily the analyst who accepted the AI's flawed recommendation, maybe under pressure, maybe suffering from automation bias, without doing enough independent checking? Is it the programmers who wrote the algorithm, maybe unintentionally building in flaws? Is it the intelligence officers who gathered and labeled the training data, possibly embedding biases? Or does the responsibility lie higher up the chain of command?
It diffuses responsibility.
It does. The sources frame this blurring of responsibility as a major open question and a huge challenge for ensuring accountability in this new era of AI-assisted warfare.
Given these profound legal and ethical questions raised by critics and experts in the sources, it's important we circle back one more time to present the IDF's counterposition on its adherence to international humanitarian law, as stated in the sources.
Right. The IDF statement reasserts their commitment to upholding international law. They state they only strike military targets and military operatives, and that their operations follow the principles of proportionality and taking precautions to minimize civilian harm.
And they mention investigating issues.
Yes. They state that exceptions or unintended negative outcomes are thoroughly examined and investigated. They also clarify their position that members of organized armed groups, or people directly participating in hostilities, are considered lawful targets under IHL and the policies of law-abiding countries, including their own policy, which they state didn't change during the war.
And their efforts to reduce civilian harm.
They conclude by stating they make continuous efforts to reduce harm to civilians to the extent feasible in the operational circumstances ruling at the time of the strike.
Okay, so based purely on the sources provided for this deep dive, we have this situation where critics undo the reported effects of the AI-assisted targeting, and the alleged procedures described by anonymous sources violate fundamental IHL principles. Meanwhile, the IDF maintains its operations, guided by human review and adhering to strict internal procedures, are fully compliant with international law. It's a deeply contested space based on the information presented.
Absolutely. And this specific case, as reported and debated in the sources, hasn't just raised immediate intense concerns. It also connects directly to much larger ongoing international conversations about the very future of warfare and the increasing role of artificial intelligence in life and death decision-making.
It definitely makes you think about what future battlefields might look like. Is this dramatically faster pace, this reported shift towards targeting larger numbers of lower-ranking individuals, potentially with a higher accepted civilian cost, is that becoming the new reality in urban conflicts?
And what does that really mean for the role of humans in the loop? If systems like Lavender and Gospel can churn out targets at lightning speed, and Fire Factory can plan the strikes in minutes, what does human control actually mean in practice when you're under that kind of immense operational pressure?
It really pushes on those ongoing international debates about regulating autonomous weapon systems and defining significant human control.
Right. As Elise Vincent notes in Le Monde, most militaries say their systems keep humans in control. But the specific details emerging from Gaza, as described in those reports, citing anonymous officers, especially the allegations about automation bias effectively rubber stamping decisions, or those alleged preset kill limits, those could potentially make the current, somewhat vague definitions of human control seem insufficient or even obsolete to international observers and policymakers.
It could really energize calls for stricter definitions.
It could. It might strengthen calls for much clearer, more stringent regulatory definitions of what constitutes genuinely meaningful or significant human control over decisions involving lethal force. Lord Dordarusi Roshagan is quoted pointing to a core issue here: the lack of transparency.
The black box problem again.
Yeah, the lack of transparency about the algorithms and the data used by these systems. While maybe not every military tool needs full transparency, she argues it becomes critically necessary when a system's outputs are directly leading to life or death decisions affecting civilians on potentially a mass scale. You need to know how it's working.
And ultimately, that profound challenge of accountability we talked about, it just remains a critical, unresolved question, not just for this specific conflict, but for the whole trajectory of integrating AI into military operations globally. Who, at the end of the day, is truly answerable when the complex interplay of algorithms, data, operational pressure, and human choices leads to devastating outcomes?
So if we step back and try to summarize the core tension presented across all the source material we've unpacked in this deep dive, what have we seen?
Well, we've seen this picture painted of AI systems, the Gospel, Lavender, Fire Factory, reportedly enabling a massive acceleration and increase in the sheer volume of targeting in Gaza.
Right, the efficiency and speed gains. But juxtaposed against that,
Juxtaposed with really serious concerns raised in these reports, concerns about the scale of civilian harm, about potential violations of core international humanitarian law principles like proportionality and distinction, deep questions about how effective human oversight really is when dealing with automation bias and intense pressure.
the acknowledged risks of algorithmic bias stemming from the training data, and these incredibly difficult challenges in ensuring real accountability when AI is so deeply woven into the targeting process.
And it is absolutely vital to keep stressing. The sources we've used here present different, often conflicting accounts and interpretations. We have detailed reports based on anonymous intelligence officers and expert analysis on one side,
And the official counter-statements and positions provided by the IDF on the other. Our whole aim here has been to neutrally convey the information and the different perspectives contained within these specific sources for you, the listener, to consider.
which leaves us, I think, with a pretty significant final thought for you to ponder as you reflect on this deep dive.
What's that?
As these AI systems become more and more deeply integrated into complex human decisions with potentially life and death consequences on a massive scale, what does the reported experience with these specific systems in Gaza tell us? What does it suggest about the fundamental safeguards, the necessary level of transparency, and the robust ethical and legal frameworks that we as a global community need to demand and maybe establish?
And perhaps even more fundamentally, What does this specific situation as reported imply for the very meaning and the necessity of genuine human control when we deploy highly automated systems that wield lethal power in the conflicts of the future?